welcome back. Our rig is finished. This will be the last proper video. This is the last how to rig a character video. We're going to have one more bonus video after this as an add-on, just to show you how to do very simple master controls for this character. Rotating the body, rotating the head, building a very simple template. But for this video, we are going to go over cleaning up the file. How to prep this file so you can submit it to a client or for a studio, presumably if you're not working on a server, and how to clean up the keys in the file for master controls and for animation. I'll go over a lot of really neat stuff that I never see anybody really discuss, and kind of proper etiquette for cleaning up the file. The first thing we are going to do is we're going to save. Just make sure this is a working file, so you're not going to be deleting anything out of this specific file. This is if something's wrong, you need to come back and adjust stuff. Once you turn this into a template, you don't want to start trying to work from that template. You want to make sure everything is here. Just save this as you normally would. We're going to give a top peg an even higher peg, and this is going to be the official name of the character. So our character is called Car for character underscore Kiki, and then just call it peg. We're going to lift this out as far away, and then we're going to drag over our entire rig, select it, and then Control G to group it, bring the peg and the group together, and this is our rig. We're going to grab the name, so character Kiki, just call the group Car Kiki. And we have these two additional ports. This is every time there's an open-ended peg or there's a peg transformation, it's going to try and escape the group. We're going to bring our multi-port over and just delete everything, so we only have our peg. We're going to do the same for our multi-port out at the bottom. We see there's a composite here for something, so we can go check out what that is. And it's the shoe. Yeah, so if there's anything that's just like a random export, it will try and leave the group, so you can delete everything. So at the top of our group, we only want a peg leaving, and at the bottom, we only want a main composite leaving. This is when you go through the entire group and just make sure there's nothing straggling. So make sure there's no just random cutter hanging around that's not actually plugged into anything. And once we've done that, we want to go find any groups, the mount group, and make sure our toolkit isn't in any of these groups. It's not crazy terrible if you've forgotten a toolkit somewhere. It's just gonna be unnecessary and might confuse people that don't know what it is. See, for example, toolkit. And we can leave it on the outside just in case we need. The inside of the group looks good. So what we're going to do, in the timeline, we're going to have this new setup. So here are original keyframes. We don't want to collapse this and start setting new keyframes here, because this is the peg that people will grab when starting a scene. So if scene prep, for example, are putting a rig into a scene with an animatic, and they need the character to be over here and scaled up, like so. We don't want them to scale this up and then suddenly go to the next keyframe and it's been reset because you've left keyframes on this peg. This peg should have no keyframes. With our group made, we're going to check to make sure each of our keys are keyed individually and not overexposed on the rig. I'll explain what that means now in a second, but we have two ways of doing that. Version 1 gives you an overall kind of look at the rig, so it kind of helps. I prefer to do version 2 because I find it a lot quicker, especially if you're working in a fast-paced environment. But what do I mean? If we go and find a drawing, and then we come over to our timeline and hit O, these are key exposures, so you see the way each of them have their own individual rectangle, while this is an exposed exposure. So this is one drawing exposed over a long amount of time. This means that each of these are being exposed every single frame. This is good, this is bad. Now how do we look at every single drawing and make sure they're all exposed? If you organized everything correctly, you should be able to hold Control and drag over all of your drawings. Skipping the groups, because if we select the groups, that's going to select pegs and deformers and all that stuff. And with everything selected, we're going to right click and go to tag and select timeline tag. What that does is, over here in your timeline, in the very bottom left, there's this thing called view modes, and you can actually change the mode in which you're looking. So we're currently in normal view mode. Now we can view tagged layers. So this will show us everything that we've tagged and will tell us what instance the drawing is on. So if it's on or off or 1 or 2. And especially stuff like this belt. So if we go to our belt, this red dot means that our actual drawing is keyed. We don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to delete that key and then re-expose it. And then now push this back with the peg instead. You're going to make sure that there's no keys. Make sure everything is stepped, and here's our issues. Our hand is stepped perfectly, but for some reason over here, it's going to be continuously exposed. You can see the mouth is also doing this. So we're going to use our bracket keys and just unexpose all of these. And our rig is perfect. We had a few hiccups with some keys, but overall the rig looks pretty great. Now let's say you have a bunch of sections that are like this where everything is overexposed. If you want to turn them into key exposures, you just have to select them, right click, expose, and then add key exposure, and that will key every single one. So you want to make sure all of your rig has these key exposures. These ones over here don't matter as much. We will be doing one for the head. That will matter. But because these are all exposed over here, that shouldn't be an issue. Also, make sure you go back and go into your groups and make sure all of your groups are also exposed. So we can select them, tag, timeline tag. And now that everything is exposed, we can go through. See, this happens if you've accidentally selected a group at any stage. You'll have kind of some of these weird areas, but these aren't actually drawings, so we can just kind of ignore those. And our rig is looking cool. So you could hand this up as it is. This is perfect. This is a great rig. It's clean, well organized. We're going to add some extras just to give it a boost and make it look a bit more presentable and easier to use. First of all, we're going to give it a composite. We're going to call this the character's name. Comp for composite. Along with this, we're going to give it a display. Character's name, display. This is so if we're working with multiple characters, you can individually come up here and just look at the specific character that you want. Some more handy bits. We are going to come into the group and we're going to go up to the hands of the character. For example, if we make a prop, give it a peg, plug it into that port, so it's going to be attached to the second hand, and then we draw an object right here. That means that we have access to this prop outside of the group. We don't have to keep going in and out to grab it. And if we just hit B twice, it'll bring us directly to the hand, and the prop will be attached to the hand. So we're going to do that for both hands. So port 1 is going to be hand 1, and port 2 is going to be hand 2. A Another thing we can do inside this group that can be handy depending on the show or the production or the people that are going to be handling the rig, we can give the character a shadow. So if we just insert a backdrop over here, give it its own little area, call it shadow. We can make a drawing called shadow. Give that a peg. The peg will not be following any of these pegs because we don't want the shadow to be moving when we're trying to flip or move anything else. So this will actually come from the multiport in and attach to the shadow peg. And then the bottom of the shadow will leave the multiport out on the very far right. And this port will now be a shadow. So if we go, we're going to go back to our normal view, give the shadow a blank drawing, call it off, give it a normal drawing. You notice in our toolkit, we've already made a shadow color. So we can make a rectangle, rotate it so it's more of a diamond, squash it, extend it, and then just pull on the edges. Now our character has a shadow. We can fill this in, we can give it a deformer, give it extra points. Make sure anything you add is exposed in its individual keys for the entire turn. And then we're going to push this shadow back because these legs tend to get generally pushed back in different views. So we're going to pull this back 0.005. There we go. And then we're going to just bring its peg down. Now your character has a drop shadow. You can apply your own transparency node to the design, or you can just have the transparency be in the actual palette. So the alpha is set to 50. So we're just going to delete the exterior line and then leave the shadow. And now your character has a drop shadow, and it can be easily plugged out outside the group. The last two things we're going to make for this little area is we are going to make a scaling reference. So just call it scale, or you can call it the character's name. So character Kiki scale, because multiple characters will have a scale. Plug it in, give it a peg, plug that into the top peg, and this scale doesn't have to have an off instance. It's pretty much always going to be on or unplugged. So we're just going to give it a drawing and just make a square. Go to give it a little design. So copy the square, shrink it, and then just give it a circle in the center so it's easier to grab onto. So this is a scale reference. This is so if you have multiple characters in a scene and you start messing around with the individual pegs, you just want to make sure that these references line up, and then you know that your characters are all in the same scale. We can give this a visibility node and then set the visibility to soft render so we can see it when we're looking through the OpenGL, and then when we're actually in render view, you won't be able to see it. And the last thing we need is a note. So this is going to be character Kiki notes. Just leave it right here to the left. And this is going to have a couple of details about the character. So this is going to be character Kiki version 1 built from character Kiki version 1. So if you are making a character from another character, here's where you put in the details, being like, I used the legs of this character and the hands of this character. So the animators know if they need to use animation reuse, they can take that reuse from those characters. It's also extremely helpful if you maybe a couple of months into a project and a rig is broken and you don't know which version of the rig it is. This will tell you what version it is. This will help you know if it's a modern version or not. And then you put in the date, so it's the 23rd of the 6th, 2024. Ports, here's when we do ports, so port 1, port 2, port 3, port 4. Port 1, so these are the ports. So our first port is the rig. Our second port is hand 01. Our second port is hand 02. And our third port is our shadow. This is so when animators get this rig, they know exactly what each of these ports are for. Generally, if you're working on a project for a while, you kind of know what the ports are for. It's just for new people and just to be extra sure. And say this is like version 10, highly likely you'd get to a version 10. But if this is a different version and there's fixes to it, you can just leave notes down at the bottom being like, this is what was changed, this is what was fixed. Or if you turn this on, this will happen, With all of those made, we're going to drag select. We're going to insert a backdrop. We're going to call it character Kiki. And then whatever version the character is, so version 01. And that is your rig. Some more stuff you can go over, but a lot of people will have this issue. Every time you open up a scene, you might have like a million different files over here, like in your palettes. So the palettes can be kind of confusing. Sure, you have these two palettes. You have your character and then you have your toolkit. And then your other two palettes are blacked out. That's because you can only access them if you click on the black select mouse, and then now you can go over and look at those other palettes. So these are your color palettes, these are your texture palettes, and these are all of your palettes. So if we're using a brush and on our character and we transfer it, this will have that information on it. So generally you only want 3 palettes. You want the character palette, you want the toolkit palette, and you want your texture palette. A quick way of getting rid of everything is if you go to File and then Remove Unused Files. If you have a bunch of palettes that aren't being used, I can't view it here because the palettes are clean, but you'll get a little directory with all of the palettes, and it'll tell you if they're actively being used in a scene, and then you can just mass delete all of them. So a lot of people, if you're constantly opening random files, you'll just have a big collection of all of those palettes. It's best to keep these clean and orderly, because if a character has a certain palette and then later on production decides, oh no, we want the skin tone to be slightly different, or we want her clothes to be slightly different, and then you have to apply that palette, it's gonna be a nightmare trying to find the correct one. Alright, we have our character made and organized. We have our palettes clean, we have all of our frames keyed, and the last thing I would recommend going over is the X sheet. A lot of the time you would be using the X sheet for expressions. Don't worry about it, it's confusing, not relevant. What I'd like to do is, it's kind of like a version of tagging where if you open it, you not only get to see if everything's exposed, so you see the way these are lines, this is an overexposure, this is it being exposed for multiple frames. The fact that each of these have individual instances shows that everything is keyed correctly, but you also get to see the actual individual names of the keys. So this is where you'd find if there's no keys turned on or if keys are named correctly. So sometimes if you're working for multiple productions, they'll have different ways of saying off. It'll be off or N or ED or whatever. So sometimes you can accidentally start naming stuff incorrectly. This will show you if you've done that. You can also kind of get a nice view of your hands and all of your library substitutions. Our X sheet looks perfect because we've followed the rules and we've done everything very neatly. Now, the last thing to do is export as a TPL. A TPL is a template. That's what you would see if you go over to your library tab and then you start selecting stuff and dragging stuff into a file. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click in our library, give ourselves the right to modify, just so you can mess around with any file. And then we're going to open library, go to a file that we need. So we have a TPL file for our rig. I have my editing and reference and working files. This is currently my working file. If we go into our TPLs, select folder. Now we have our TPLs over here. We can right to modify so we can access it. And now all we need to do is select our rig, Control C to copy. Over in this black box, click right click, paste, and then we get to name our character. This can get a bit buggy. If you try and name it, it'll just like kick you out of the naming process. But looks like we're working well. So character Kiki, we can call this V1, and then click OK. So now this is saved as a template. This means that if you have access to this template folder, you can just drag this into a scene and you now have the rig available. But we don't want to do that just yet because we still have all of this stuff in the file that was saved over that is unnecessary. So what we can do is click on the file, right click, and edit template. It'll take a second and it'll load and open up the template file, which will just be another scene. Once we open up our template to edit it, we just want to make sure that everything that needs to be exposed is exposed. Generally stuff we've done after we've already cleaned up the rig, so you know this scale is not fully exposed. And we're going to want to open up the rig in the timeline and just look for anything that is locked. So the tabs are currently locked because we're going to be grabbing everything and moving it. We're going to open up to frame 200, grab our characters, cut them, move them to 200, paste. Here's where you cycle through and make sure that everything has pasted correctly. Plug in your shadow, make sure that has come across. And now every frame up until 199 is going to get deleted. Some stuff we have to be careful about. So for example, the hair shadow, because the hair is connected to a peg transformation, it's not going to be connected to the rig. So it will have some information on it, but you see we have this black keyframe, which means that there is a motion tween on the keyframe. So if we were to copy and paste this for an animation, that might start to tween unintentionally. So we have to make sure that these are all turned off by hitting this set stop motion keyframe. We can test it by just grabbing one of the keys, going to frame 1, pasting it, and then just checking and making sure nothing is breaking on the timeline. Because there is a frame on frame 200 and there's a frame on frame 1, it's going to want to just expand that exposure for that entire way, which is, you know, generally fine. You're going to be using it. This is why we put everything on frame 200, because most scenes don't really go that high. You can also just leave these frames at the start. It doesn't really matter. I think it depends on the production you're on. A lot of people prefer it at the end, a lot of people prefer it at the start. Some people prefer for them to all be at the end, but for one keyframe to be at the very start, just so they know that the rig is there. I think just for ease of access at this point, we're just going to leave them all in the front. Make sure no keys are exposed past the turnaround, and then we're going to collapse the template to only cover the turnaround. Once we hit save, it's going to prompt us. This template will no longer be an action template. Do you want to save? Yes. Then it's going to start generating, and then we can close this. And because it started that little generation process, it'll give us a little preview of our character that we can go through. This is also how you would save animation reuse. If you've done a bit of animation with this character, you would save those keys like that, put it over here, and then just save it as wave front view. And then you can get like a little preview of that, what that is. You can just drag it into your timeline and it will paste that animation over. So now, if we drag this character into our scene, she should be perfect. If you keep getting an issue like this, where you keep getting this prompt, it's really annoying. Sometimes it just does it because Toon Boom is confused and thinks there's a color when there isn't. You can click yes, click on your character, go to the palette, right click on it, recolor, and then just select anything, doesn't really matter. And then you can delete it, and hopefully it'll stop prompting. Most of the time it doesn't. So that is how to rig a character. Hopefully you've learned everything you need to know to build a strong character. I tried to go as basic as possible and then have the supplementary videos along with them, like the introduction to cutters video. You should be able to follow this out the gate, but if you don't worry about it. Everyone starts off slow, and then you build something and you think it's amazing, and then a week later you come back and you look at it and it's absolutely horrible. And it's trash and you hate it and you're like, oh, I can't believe I gave that to somebody to use. And then sometimes you go, oh, I built this like 3 years ago, it's probably gonna be awful. And you look at it, you go, actually this was pretty good, I'm very proud of myself. You know, rigging is very complicated. It all depends on effort and repetition and knowledge and getting used to something. You might have all of the knowledge at the start, and then it comes to, okay, now I need to learn how to do it faster. But then you're learning how to do it faster, and then you're forgetting about quality. So then you need to focus on quality, and you're constantly going through all of these different stages. And it's beautiful, man, you know? So as I've probably mentioned before, there should be a additional bonus video to this video, probably going to be very short, on just how to make very simple master controls. That should come out extremely quickly. I don't even know if it's going to be waiting a week for it to come out. I might upload them both at the same time, but that's it. This is how to rig a character. I plan on doing more videos like this, a lot simpler template characters. How to convert a character into another character, how to say reuse, all of that jazz. But I hope you enjoyed these 6-ish hours of edited videos, which has been about 20-30 hours for me in editing them. Yeah, thanks for watching.